The views expressed on this program are those of the producers and individuals appearing on this program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Sun Prairie Media Center staff, its video service providers, or the staff and elected officials of the City of Sun Prairie.
Hey everyone, this is Rose Daly, the City Sustainability Coordinator of Sun Prairie, and you're listening to the Sustainable Sun Prairie podcast, the show that aspires to educate, empower, and engage our listeners in all aspects of sustainability. Whether you are a seasoned sustainability enthusiast or just beginning your sustainability journey, each episode will have something new and exciting for everyone. Let's begin the conversation for a greener community. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sustainable Sun Prairie podcast. Spring has officially sprung here in Wisconsin, which means our natural environment is buzzing with excitement. As our local pollinators emerge from hibernation, our lawns become green again and flowers begin to bloom. Amidst the seasonal splendor, there's important work to be done, work that involves our beloved pollinators and the vital ecosystems they support. Have you ever heard of No Mow May or wondered about the magic of community pollinator gardens? Well, you're in for a treat because today we're discussing these eco-friendly practices and exploring how they're sowing the seeds of change in our local landscape. I've invited a special guest to join me today who has extensive experience in establishing public pollinator gardens. Welcome, Terry. How are you doing today?
I'm good.
Good. Are you enjoying the warmer weather?
Yeah, it's great. Good biking weather.
Oh,
so
yes. Did you get out
great.
biking this past weekend?
Yeah.
Nice.
That was on Saturday. It was pretty nice.
It was. Yeah, I love the warm weather. I love the spring rains too.
Mm-hmm.
So would you be able just to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Mm-hmm. I'm a retired Lutheran clergy person, and I'm also a retired Air Force chaplain. I was married to Reverend Sue Moline Larson for almost 54 years until Sue passed away very unexpectedly in February of 2023. She grew up on a dairy farm in northeast Iowa, and she loved her rural roots. I grew up in rural Nebraska, and I also have good memories of my rural roots. In fact, my three siblings and I still own a small farm in northeast Nebraska which uses sustainable practices such as no-till planting, native pollinator plants in swales and in ditches, and uses terraces and windbreaks. And I'm proud of the way it's farmed using earth care practices. In 2017, my wife and I worked with the Dane County Extension to plant one of the first public pollinator gardens in Sun Prairie. It was planted along Linnerud Drive near the Sun Prairie Community Gardens. It continues to be a vibrant garden providing pollinator plants for butterflies, bees, birds, and bugs. Because of Sue's advocacy, a pollinator garden was planted in her honor at Sheet Park in Sun Prairie, and we had the dedication of that park on Earth Day weekend these past weeks, and it really is a meaningful remembrance of her advocacy for Earth care.
I love that. I love that you guys chose a pollinator garden to remember her, because you could have chosen like a tree or like a plaque somewhere, but I think that's so meaningful to have that garden.
Yeah, that's great.
I wanted to comment on your farming background. So I'm very intrigued by the sustainable farming practices that you and your siblings implement on your farm. I recently watched the documentary Kiss the Ground. Have you heard of that one or seen it?
No, I haven't.
They really dive into regenerative agriculture. So I learned about the importance of no-till farming to ensure our carbon remains in the soil. So I'll have to bring you back on the show another time so we can talk about sustainable farming. But I'm very interested in that.
It's really a joy to see the practices that are used on that farm, and the Nebraska Department of Agriculture had a grant that would pay for pollinator plants to plant along the edges of fields.
Yeah.
I think that's really progressive.
Yes, and that's so
that's
smart
great.
because like you want to bring pollinators to your farm
exactly.
to pollinate, but they're
Right.
not going to go there unless there's like native species.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really a joy to see that.
Yes. Yeah, I think I just love how we can like use nature to our advantage and just like let it work
Absolutely.
naturally. Yeah.
Rather than work against it.
Right. Just a quick fun little story. So when I lived in Costa Rica, we visited a coffee bean farm, and the farmers there had said that the monkeys come in and they love just eating the coffee beans, which they didn't like. And in Costa Rica, they don't like using pesticides or herbicides or anything to keep animals away because they're I guess beyond us in that. So what they did instead is they planted banana trees around the coffee ground plot. So the monkeys would show up and eat the bananas, but then leave the coffee grounds alone. So it was like a very smart way to just like take advantage of nature.
Oh, yeah.
And also like make sure the monkeys aren't being harmed, right? So
Right.
yeah.
That's great.
All right, Terry. So I don't know if you listened to my last episode, but our special Earth Day episode was focused on like how to create a pollinator paradise in your backyard. So I interviewed Cindy Bertley, and we walked our listeners through what it takes to establish a pollinator habitat in our own yards. So today I really want to zoom out a little bit and discuss pollinator conservation from the perspective of our community, and specifically through the lens of community pollinator gardens. So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit more about your experience with community pollinator gardens.
After the first public pollinator garden that we planted was planted along Linnerud Drive, we attended a meeting of the Sun Prairie Park's Friends asking if they'd support pollinator gardens in the community parks. Well, they were terrifically supportive of that. And so we planted a large garden at Wetmore Park near the splash pad. Since then, we planted gardens in 8 more parks, and we'll plant 4 more parks this year.
Wow. Okay, so this really wouldn't have been possible without the support of the park friends then.
Right. It's well, and the great thing about the Park Friends organization is they work closely with the Sun Prairie Parks, Recreation, and Forestry Department, Cindy Bertley.
Yeah.
And Kristen. So that's really great, and they were providing the personnel plus the opportunity for me to connect to Plant Dane with a nonprofit organization, because Plant Dane works with nonprofit organizations as well as individuals, but the nonprofit organizations are really front and center in their good support of things like pollinator gardens. And we were inspired to do this because certainly we wanted to provide habitat for the pollinators, but also having gardens in very public, accessible places, so people who happen to be walking by on a sidewalk would see the pollinator garden, would see the identifying signs and the identifying markers of the different plants, and they would kind of get a sense of what that plant looks like, and maybe they would have interest in putting it in their own garden or their own yard.
So you can inspire others then.
Yeah, that was, and the woman we worked with from the Dane County Extension was she was all in on pollinator gardens, and it was hard not to catch her enthusiasm, and so that was really great.
Good. It sounds like you guys have had so much support for this, which I love.
Yeah, that's great.
What would you say from your perspective is the value of community gardens, both like to the environment as well as to our community members?
First of all, it would be it would take up an area that's not being mowed, and it would be a natural habitat, and it would provide habitat for pollinating insects. But secondly, the native pollinator plants are beautiful.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
gorgeous plants.
Mm-hmm.
They're very the native plants they thrive in Wisconsin, in southern Wisconsin, and they provide blooms all season long as you rotate through the different kinds of plants. They give people an opportunity to see and identify the plants, and that's great.
That is, yeah. I remember when I interviewed Cindy, we talked about the importance of having like a steady bloom from like spring, summer, fall. There's
Right.
always something blooming in your
Yeah.
garden. So I think that's a huge value for the pollinators, but also for our community, because there's always going to be
absolutely.
like new flowers they can see when they visit the park.
And of course, I have my favorites. Golden Alexanders are early. They start early. They'll bloom until maybe early June, and then the lance leaf coreopsis come on and provide flowers for the next couple of months. And then you get into late August, early September, and you have these wonderful asters, whether it's blue stem aster, New York aster, whatever. Those asters will provide flowers until it freezes. And
Wow.
so there's a continuation. But those are my three favorite
Ooh.
pollinators that carry through the season.
I love that. I'll have to make notes so I can put those in my garden. So I think another huge benefit of community gardens is the community involvement that typically comes with establishing it. So I'm sure there's often like many hands that contribute to planting and maintenance and watering. So I'm just curious to know what types of people have helped set up our community gardens, and what have their reactions been like?
One of the first public community gardens we did 2 or 3 years ago was over at Sunny Valley Park, and not too far from where I live. And so the neighbor children helped plant that garden, and they were enthusiastic. Their parents were enthusiastic. The neighbors have been enthusiastic. That's really the great thing. There's a connection that is made with these gardens, with the neighboring families who are living around the particular park. And so they have been very enthusiastic, very helpful in weeding, and in a couple of parks they've been good help in watering those really young plants. So yeah, it's been great. I love seeing children plant the pollinators. They're on a good day very careful and are not stepping on them. But it's really fun to watch. And
Yeah, I feel like our native plants are really resilient. So even if they get stomped on, like they'll pop back up.
Right. Yeah, they are. They resilient is the word. That's great. But for a couple of those kids who helped plant that garden a couple of years ago, they still feel like they have some ownership in it.
Oh,
so
yeah.
when they go past that,
They check on their
still
plans.
point to it,
Yeah.
or they'll walk over and that it gets a little bit dicey if they start weeding, because oftentimes these native pollinator plants look like a weed, and especially before they start blooming. So I'm thinking that, but they're like I say, they're very, very resilient.
Yes. Yeah, that's the struggle, is when they're so small. It's like, is this a weed or is this my plant?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now that we've talked about the importance of community pollinator gardens, I thought we could kind of dive into the nitty-gritty of how to bring these blossoming havens to life. So could you maybe talk us through the process of establishing a community garden and what steps are required?
The really good news with native pollinator plants is they don't need good or amended soil. They can grow in really a lot of different kinds of soil. Some plants do better in mucky, wet soil, and some do better in dry soil. But if you have a variety in the garden, they kind of even out. They can grow in all sorts of soil. For instance, plants like swamp milkweed. They like heavy, wet soil.
I didn't know we had a swamp milkweed. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, it's really a very thick-stemmed
very
plant.
hardy.
It is, yeah, and especially if they're in a wet environment. And so soon I planted a native garden at Bird School in 2022 in honor of Julie Schwellenbach, who was a longtime speech therapist and environmentalist and member of the Dane County Board. And she died in 2021. And we put that garden in an area that had been fill dirt near the school, and it was very heavy clay, and the swamp milkweeds are thriving in that garden.
That's impressive.
Yeah. Julie's garden is a good example of what is needed in public gardens, what the process is in establishing a community public garden. And I'll go through the process we used when we put that garden in at Bird School, kind of as an illustration of what some of the elements are that need to be covered when you plan that.
Okay, but you recommend if people want to go look at an effective garden, they should go visit that one at Bird School?
Yeah, especially the end of July.
End of July,
it just
okay.
It explodes.
Love that.
Yeah. But the first thing we needed to do for that particular garden, we needed to work with the Sun Prairie School Administration as well as the principal to gain approval and support of a visible, easily accessible location, because we wanted it to be close enough to a sidewalk in order for the children to be able to see the plants up close and not have it off in some obscure place. So we found a good place not too far from the front of the school. And
okay, I want to pause here really quick before you continue on. I want to talk a little bit more about seeking permission and working with stakeholders to find this location, because if we think about our own backyards, the only stakeholders we have to talk to is ourselves and maybe a neighbor if we're plotting something close to the lot line. But I know when you're doing a community garden, there's a lot more stakeholders you have to talk to. Which will really dictate the position of your garden. So I'm just curious to know, in all these gardens you've established, would you say there's any lessons learned regarding seeking permission or talking to stakeholders that you could share with our listeners?
Yeah, the initial response from the administration was a little cautious because there hadn't been gardens established at schools, other than I think one of the middle schools there was a teacher and some students who put a garden in, but no outside group had come in to talk to them, and so they were appropriately cautious. But the other thing that we learned is the people that we ought to have talked to also, as well as the principal, was the maintenance staff and the people who do the snow plowing, because it was the first winter and our signs were knocked over by the snow plow because they come in and try to do the plowing as quickly as possible. And the area where we planted the pollinator garden was one of the places they pushed the snow, and so that was a little bit upsetting. And then we've learned that we need to take the signs out in November.
I see.
And fortunately, the snow hasn't, it's been a couple winters now, and the snow off the parking lot doesn't seem to have harmed the pollinator plants.
Because they're
even
so
though
resilient.
there might be a little bit of salt with that, but the good news is they plow that lot prior to cars coming in. You know, they plow plow it early in the morning, and ideally before all
gets in there from the cars.
all the other crud accumulates. So, but that certainly was a lesson learned that we needed to involve maintenance.
Okay, so talk to maintenance, lawn keepers, groundkeepers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and they were the other resource they provided. They had after probably a month, they had this great hose set up with a timer that they had put on the garden, and it was perfect. They really did a great job with that. So, yeah, the maintenance department are our friends.
Yes, they'll be your friends.
Yeah.
Okay, so what other steps are required once we get owner or permission?
Yeah, after that, developing a partnership with a group of people who will help plant and care for the garden. We worked with the Sun Prairie Action Resource Coalition, Spark, to help with the bird school garden, because Julie was also an active member in Spark, and Sue was as well, and so that was a good organization to connect with. And then after that, we the third step would be acquire the native plants through reputable company. Plant Dane, who provides reduced cost plants to nonprofits, gets their plants from Agricol. And we had about 120 plants donated for that particular garden plot. And the plants were all full sun or partial sun plants, with some being early, some mid, some late. So that was a great variety. And then fourth, when we were planting the garden, we included not only the members of Spark, but also middle school and high school youth recruited by the community schools representative at Bird School. We attempted to get as broad a spectrum of community people as possible, and the downside of that is that the more people you get involved in planting, potentially the more chaotic it's going to be, and the placement of the plants may not be spaced as well as what I, as a person who would be a little bit more particular, would want to be.
Yeah.
But it was great to have these kids involved. We had like 8 or 10 kids who were helping with that, or young people, I should say. They were middle school and high school young people, and the way we did it to help try to keep plants from being stepped on was we divided the plot into quadrants, and then we had them start from the center and move to the edge. So all 4 groups started kind of like 4 pieces of a pie. So we moved from the center outward, and so
that's really smart.
Yeah, that seemingly worked pretty well. It helped prevent trampling on the plants. And then the next step was providing signage to indicate the name of the plant, and a picture of a mature plant, as well as a QR code. We had these small aluminum signs that we placed by many of the plants to identify what they were.
Okay. What would the QR code link to? Was it just more information about the plant?
Yeah, the QR code. Each plant had I forget what the website was, but it was a website that detailed all the facts about a particular pollinator plant.
Okay.
You know, that we couldn't. There wasn't room on the sign to provide all that information. But
okay, I love that educational piece. That's really important.
Yeah. And last, it's important to have a good water source and provide regular attention to the weeding, especially in the first couple of years. These plants are generally hardy enough, and many of them are aggressive enough to make sure the weeds don't take over in subsequent years, but initially they need to have some help.
Right.
And if you've ever seen a picture of the depth of the roots of pollinator plants,
very impressive.
Just blows you away.
Nothing can compete with that.
No, that's they're so great.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's really great to know these like 6 steps you've laid out. That's super helpful. Well, let's talk a little bit about selecting a location. So what are some things you consider when you're selecting a pollinator garden location?
Ideally, it's a sunny location where there's not a lot of shrubbery or trees that are going to compete for shade and for water. But even in partially shady locations, they generally do all right. In fact, the first garden we planted was a partially shaded location because of the necessity of being close to a sidewalk where people would be able to see the plants and be close to the plants. The plants do well as long as they get enough water. And sometimes, like in that garden on Linnerud, that there's a linden tree very close. And with the linden tree, the roots are fairly shallow, so they're pulling the same water that the plants want to use, and they're so there's competition. But as long as they get enough water, even in partial shade locations, they do fine.
Okay, that's good to know. So I wanted to take a minute to talk about the water piece. So in our own yards, we often take our water source for granted because most of us do have that like hose spigot on our house, and then we just buy a garden hose that it's the length that we need. But I know when you're looking at a community garden, probably water source has a bigger influence on your location. So could you talk a little bit more about the water source piece of this?
As we're looking at planting in the variety of Sun Prairie parks, we're using the signage, the park sign, as the anchor for the garden, and then we plant the plants around that sign. And unfortunately, most of the parks don't have a water source. The larger parks have the water source, but the neighborhood parks, they don't have a water source. And so I've used 5-gallon buckets that I've carried in the trunk of my car that have been, it's been enough to keep them. They keep the young plants alive, and then the second year they do even better, and they don't need as much water. And then after the second year, they're really good to go. But another piece that's been really a happy finding is that I've contacted some of the neighbors in nearby yards to where the pollinator garden is, and have asked if it gets really dry, if they could, their garden hose would reach. Like 100-foot garden hose would reach, and they've been very, very good about that. They're open to doing that. And,
good.
So it's a way of connecting with neighbors also. And
another way to pull in like more volunteers, get more people involved.
And that's been. It's a challenge, but it's not something we can't overcome.
Right, because I was thinking, wow, you carried buckets of water in your car, like you weren't going to let that lack of water source stop you. All right. So when would you say is the best time of year to plant a community garden? I know people typically say spring or fall. Do you have a preference?
I have a preference right around the 18th of May.
Oh, that's very specific.
Yeah, in fact, the Saturday, this this year is the 18th, but generally that's when we get the plants. The third week in May is when we get the plants from Plant Dane.
Okay.
And for the Sun Prairie Parks Friends, we try to plan a planting day the same day we get the plants.
That's
so
smart.
we're not just
so they're not just sitting.
not just sitting and need to be watered, but they get into the ground very quickly. So I prefer the third week in May. Up until early June probably is a good time.
Right.
I know that Cindy Bertley is she's also been a great resource and guide as far as the plants that we split. Some of the gardens, the plants get really large and they can be split and taken to other gardens, and so she's been a good resource for that.
Oh, good.
In fact, the garden, the native area just to the east of the library is going to be, some of those plants are going to be transplanted into a new garden that Anna Stevens is going to plant, and that'll be that's her Eagle Scout project.
Ooh.
And so we'll have another pollinator garden near the sidewalk down off of Linnerud.
Okay.
So that'll be neat.
I like
and
that.
She's working hard on getting plants together for that.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. Speaking of like Eagle Scout projects, my husband told me that like majority of Eagle Scouts, they like build benches. It's like the thing they do. So I'm like happy to hear that like there's a project where they're putting in a garden and not just building a bench.
In fact, in the community garden, there's an Eagle Scout project bench that's been there like 15 years. I don't know who the Eagle Scout was.
If you see a bench, it was probably built by an Eagle Scout.
That's great.
So when we're establishing these gardens, do you recommend starting with seeds, seedlings, or mature plants?
Native plants are really difficult to get established from seeds. It's possible, but it's very slow.
Yeah.
In fact, I've had a vegetable garden behind my house for a number of decades, and the vegetables have never. I go over to the community garden. I have 2 plots over there, and that's where all my vegetables come from. So what this year I'm going to do is I'm turning that vegetable garden into a pollinator plant nursery.
Ooh.
And so I'm going to try to raise more plants from seed. And knowing that that's going to maybe take a couple years, hopefully it'll work. But the best luck we've had are the 4-inch pots with the vibrant small plants in them, and they've done really well. We've also gotten some 1-gallon pots with mature plants, and those are amazing. They really are. They really do great. The downside of a gallon pot is they're pretty expensive.
Yeah, the cost. Yeah.
But they are really nice.
Okay. Got it. Yeah, I have had bad luck with starting pollinator plants from seeds, so I would also recommend the seedlings. Unless you're like an expert and you have a green thumb, then you can give it a try.
Yeah.
So you have mentioned a couple times now Plant Dane and how you guys get your plants from this organization. When do you typically have to order these plants, like place that order? I'm assuming you have to do it earlier in the season, maybe back in the winter.
Yeah. We order plants from Plant Dane early March or late February, but some of the plants are not ordered until mid to late April.
Okay.
From places like White Pelican Farm in Wyacina, because that particular nursery, they sell the plants that have done well over the winter in their nursery gardens, and so instead of pre-selling plants that potentially they're not going to have enough of, they wait until a little bit later in the season, but it's all good because we typically don't plant until the third week in May or
Right. But when there's snow on the
whatever.
ground, you should already be thinking about your garden.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, so I just have one last question for you regarding this like community garden piece.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what short-term and long-term maintenance looks like on these gardens?
Yeah, of course, the short-term maintenance is watering and weeding the first couple of years. The long-term maintenance is supplementing those places in the garden where fresh plants need to go in to replace plants that have died.
Oh.
One of the hazards of having a public pollinator garden close to a sidewalk is having dogs urinating on plants. That's a death knell for a healthy pollinator plant.
Oh, geez.
Even the hardiest pollinator plants can't take that.
Right.
So
Do you guys ever put up signs that say like, no
Yeah.
dogs over here?
yeah, there are a couple of parks where we had particular challenges with dogs, and we put signs up in those parks, but we just trust that dog owners will avoid our pollinator garden. We have enough signage as far as what this is. We
Okay.
have, in fact, Dane County Extension has these great signs that they give out that indicate this is pollinator habitat, and they have a wonderful picture of a butterfly or a hummingbird, or they have 3 or 4 different kinds of signs, but those are great. And to identify this as a pollinator garden, I think most people would respect that and would
Yeah.
not allow their pets to be on that. But there's also, in thinking about long-term maintenance, some plants do better if they are split. If once they become really large, like a cup plant is a pretty aggressive plant and it spreads really well. And so to split that and to put part of that plant in another location or another garden, that works great. So that would be more long-term kind of maintenance, just to make sure that there continues to be a good variety of plants as far as the early bloomers, mid bloomers, and the late bloomers.
Okay, that's really good to know. I haven't looked into splitting plants too much, so that's like something good to keep in mind. All right, well, thanks for sharing all of this great knowledge with us on establishing community pollinator gardens. Maybe we'll see some more pop up here in Sun Prairie. But I was wondering if we could move into talking about some other things we can do to help the pollinators, specifically, what reduced mowing can look like and what that can do here in Sun Prairie. So do you have any comments on reduced mowing, or have you done it yourself to help out the pollinators?
Well, I do participate in No Mow May, and I think that's a really, really good thing to do. At one of the educational seminars that you had a couple of weeks ago, where the lead person from, I think, UW-Madison was talking about having a strip of mowed area and a strip of unmowed area, and then a census of the kinds of insects that are in the mowed area and the unmowed area. I think that's a wonderful thing, because that gives a really definite idea of what the effect of No Mow May is.
Yeah.
But the other thing I was thinking about, in fact, I was talking to one of the people from the community garden, and he was all in about planting clover lawns instead of bluegrass lawns.
Yeah.
White clover lawns that don't need to be mowed.
Yeah.
And they still are very good areas for playing frisbee or whatever, but they don't have to be mowed. And that for me that's a vision I would have of Sun Prairie parks having more white clover lawns rather than the bluegrass lawns that are required to be mowed.
That would be beautiful. I love the idea of the like low mow or no mow lawns with the clover. I've seen moss lawns, or just putting in like native grasses and letting them grow 8 inches high. I love that so much, and I feel like it just makes so much more sense. Why do we have a species growing in our lawn, the Kentucky bluegrass, that requires so much maintenance and requires us to spend so much time and so much money, when we could have more of like a natural species that's like great for pollinators, and it's like good for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good for our wallets. It's like a win-win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. It's exciting to think about those possibilities, and knowing that we're moving in that direction, that there are a lot more people who are getting on board with understanding the importance of having lawns that are not looking like a golf course.
Yeah, not the monoculture lawns. No, I've never been a fan of those. I know when I was a kid, I was like, oh, like Mom and Dad, we have too many dandelions in our yard. Like our neighbors have beautiful green lawns. But now that I've learned about the conservation, I'm like, oh, those were really bad. Like I love that my parents have dandelions all over their yard.
Yeah, that's great.
So we do have some listeners who aren't from Wisconsin. So I thought I would talk a little bit more about what the No Mow May program is, because some folks outside of our state don't know what it is. So No Mow May is a conservation initiative that encourages property owners to limit or refrain from mowing their lawns during the month of May. So we do this every year here in Sun Prairie. During the month of May, we suspend our noxious weed ordinance, and we allow our residents to grow their grass basically as tall as they want for those 30 days. And the purpose of this is in May, early May, that's when our pollinators are emerging from hibernation. And it's really critical that they find food sources during this emergence period. And, you know, like you mentioned, not all native species are blooming April, May. So one way we can provide food to them is just by letting our lawns grow. Because like you saw probably on your drive over here, there's already dandelions everywhere. So if we can just let those, you know, dandelions, clover, violets grow in our yard, we're providing food sources for those pollinators to help them like regain their footing and move into their active season. So we allow our residents to choose from a variety of options if they want to participate. So they can choose to not mow their lawn at all. They can like cut it down to mowing every other week. They can mow the front yard but not the backyard. We're really flexible with diverse lawn care practices, as long as they're just like cutting back and doing what they can. And then you had mentioned actually tracking pollinator activity data in your yard, like having the mowed patch and the unmowed patch. So something else we offer here in Wisconsin is community science opportunities. So our residents who participate can actually download the We Bee app. It's the Wisconsin Bee app. And through this app, they can track pollinator activity data. So essentially what you do is you go out in your yard once a week, you like sit at your unmowed patch of grass, and you turn on the app, and you set a timer for 5 minutes through the app, and you just observe that plot of land, and you count the number of pollinators that visit flowers inside that patch. So, you know, you record based on the type of bee. So is it a bumblebee? Is it a honeybee? Is it a large dark bee? Is it a small dark bee? Is it a green bee? Is it a non-bee? Like, does a wasp visit? Does a butterfly visit? So you record all of that, and then you actually go over to the mowed plot and you do the same thing. And it's through that data we're able to see, you know, is No Mow May actually effective? Does it actually attract pollinators? Are they coming to the, you know, our lawn flowers for food? And I actually have some exciting data to share about our results from the 2023 study. So what we found through the 2023 data is that pollinator diversity is higher in unmowed lawns compared to mowed lawns. So in the unmowed lawns, we were seeing all 6 of those species I just listed off, or those categories. In the mowed lawns, we were just seeing, I think we saw a couple small dark bees, and that was it. So diversity is higher, which makes sense. If your lawn is more diverse, you're going to have more diverse, you know, critters visiting. And then the other observation we made was that visits to flowers by wild bees were approximately twice as high in unmowed lawns compared to mowed lawns. So again, you're bringing in a greater diversity and a greater number of pollinators to that unmowed patch. So I think this local data demonstrates that No Mow May is really effective for pollinator conservation in our area, which I love because there's studies and research papers on No Mow May from all over the world, but what does it look like here in Sun Prairie? So this Wisconsin Bee app is a great way for you to gather data in your own community. Have you participated with the WeBee app before, Terry?
I haven't, but I do have it on my phone now,
Ooh,
so I'm
so
looking
you're ready?
forward to it. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Great.
Yeah, so we're excited to offer that to our residents. And then one more thing I wanted to mention is oftentimes people will say, well, if you don't have flowering species in your lawn, let's say you have that monoculture lawn, there's no point in just letting it grow. And I will say that you won't really be helping pollinator conservation by just letting grass grow, because they're not really gonna, just visit grass. They don't really do that. But what it does benefit is our local air quality. So by not mowing our lawns, we are refraining from putting those greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And we actually found in our 2023 program, we had 174 participants, and we actually refrained from emitting 2 metric tons of CO2 equivalents just by not mowing our lawns. So, if you have flowers in your lawn, great. That's great for the pollinators. If you don't, that's okay. You can still let your lawn grow out, because you're going to be helping our air quality, which is helping the pollinators like in a roundabout way. Yeah. So I think that's super exciting. This year, our city will participate in No Mow May in 9 of our local parks. So the Parks Department has a whole plan for like doing reduced mowing or no mowing in those areas, as well as on a bike path, we're going to do No Mow May. And then in the space between our library and our community garden is where we're going to do another No Mow May area. So that's what the city's doing. I'm excited to see what our residents do. Registration is still open today. It's going to be open throughout all of May. So feel free to jump on board and sign up for the program and see what cool species come to your yard this spring. Thanks for your time today, Terry. I think you provided our listeners with a ton of great resources. And I encourage everyone to check out our community gardens, participate in No Mow May if you want to, plant your own garden. But yeah, enjoy the springtime. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Sustainable Sun Prairie with your host, Rose Daly. I hope you enjoyed this episode and uncovered something new about sustainability. As always, you can subscribe to our podcast and listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and you can listen live on 103.5 FM The Sun, WLSP-LP, and on demand on the Sun Prairie Media Center app. For links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as our contact info, please visit the show notes. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.